Good afternoon, and welcome everybody to this webinar on leadership in the voluntary sector. My name is Siv Vangen. I am a professor of collaborative leadership and the founding director of the Center for Voluntary Sector Leadership here at the Open University. Thank you all for joining us. We know that a large number of people have registered with us this afternoon and are listening in, so we're really excited about that. It is also the first time that we're trying out a new webinar technology, so we hope that it's going to run fairly smoothly without any more glitches from now on. We hope that you can hear us well, that you can see our slides, that you can participate with us via your participant chats, and that you're going to like what we have to share with you this afternoon. This is the first time that we in the Center for Voluntary Sector Leadership has tried out kind of an online Friday afternoon webinar. So we're quite excited about that and excited to hear whether or not that is something that will work for you as a community. Before I introduce our first speaker today, I'd just like to say a little bit about the Center for Voluntary Sector Leadership. So CVSL for short is one of the centers of academic excellence here at the business school. And what that means is that these centers have a specific remit to do research and develop online teaching courses and material that is of particular relevance to a particular community. And of course, our community is you all and the voluntary sector. And we have a particular focus on smaller and medium-sized voluntary sector organizations and thinking about kind of research and knowledge and leadership development that might be of use and of relevance to you all. Okay, so before, I think that's enough from me. I just want to introduce Carol, who is a lecturer of management here in the business school. And before Carol joined academia or rejoined academia and did her PhD, she worked for a long time in the voluntary and public sector, advising on and leading organizational and project development. And here at the Open University, she teaches leadership and collaboration, and her research focuses particularly on leadership and collaborative working in the voluntary sector. So today she's going to talk about collaborative leadership that has come out of her own research and other colleagues here at the Open University. So over to you, Carol.
Thank you, Steve. Afternoon, everyone. Good to talk to you. Really great that you're able to join us for this lunchtime webinar. I want to talk for a few minutes about why I think that a collaborative approach to leadership is particularly relevant for voluntary organisations. So it's very common in voluntary sector to talk about the amazing individuals who've done extraordinary things, who throughout the history of the sector have stood up and fought for justice, made things happen, rescued those in need and changed society. And that's a really important part of voluntary sector history and indeed today's voluntary sector life. But we want to offer an alternative understanding, an alternative approach to leadership that I in particular want to argue has a particular relevance for 21st century voluntary organisations, and that's the idea of collaborative, or we sometimes call it collective leadership. And there are several reasons why a collaborative approach to leadership is particularly relevant for the voluntary sector. Let me first, though, say what I mean by collaborative leadership. And on the slide you hopefully now have in front of you, you'll see 3 bullet points, 3 points I want to make about not so much one theory of collaborative leadership as a set of ideas that have 3 things I would suggest in common. Firstly, collaborative leadership focuses on the idea that leadership can be shared, carried out simultaneously by more than one person, and that's initially quite a strange idea for us, because we have in our heads, I think, most of us, a picture of leadership as the leader. And I'll come back to why I think that shared approach is particularly important in voluntary organisations. Second idea is that leadership happens through the processes of interaction between people. It happens through the conversations, questions and responses that go on in organisational life, the stories that people tell one another, rather than simply through the skills or personality of an isolated individual. I think we know this in practice. We know that it's, yes, of course, the conversations at formal meetings that move an organisation forward and bring people on board, but it's also the conversations that happen around the coffee maker, in the kitchen, in the corridor, in the open plan offices, that influence the way an organisation changes and develops and bring people on board with that direction. And thirdly, leadership in our contemporary world, and possibly in the past too, but certainly in the contemporary world, is frequently concerned with reaching collaboratively across boundaries. And again, many of us will have that work experience of working in situations where we are continually working across departmental, professional, organisational and sector boundaries. So that, for the moment, is our understanding of collaborative leadership for the purposes of this webinar. Of course, there's much more that we could say if we were following this up in a webinar on another occasion. So moving on to the next slide. The first reason I think collaborative approach to leadership is particularly important in voluntary organisations is because it is actually embedded in the structure and governance of voluntary organisations. I myself am a trustee of an organisation, and many of you may be trustee board members or work with trustees. And a trustee board shares responsibility and leadership of an organisation. The members may have particular roles as chair or finance lead, safeguarding lead, whatever it may be, but they share responsibility for setting the direction of the organisation and moving it forwards. Trustees also share their leadership role with staff, and this is obviously often quite a complex area for voluntary organisations, as trustees lead, but so do staff. Who influences who initiates something, who is following, and very interesting to kind of watch that in a trustee meeting with staff and see who is leading and following at different times and the way that that's shared. And in particular, often particularly in small voluntary organisations, which CVSL is our particular remit in the Centre for Voluntary Sector Leadership, there's often an important focus on the way in which chair and chief exec share leadership. Again, in many small organisations, that's a weekly interaction in which chair and chief exec are negotiating with one another how things move forward. Of course, every organisation works this out in different ways in practice. So turning to the next slide, the second reason that I think it's important for us to think about a collaborative approach to leadership in voluntary organisations is because we talk about a sector that's informed by values. Now, again, this is a really complex issue that we could talk about at considerable length on another occasion. It doesn't necessarily mean that our values are all the same in each organisation, but there is a general assumption that voluntary organisations are informed by values of inclusion, participation, if you like, democracy. And collaborative leadership reflects these values in that it is an inclusive practice. Leadership is created by those with formal positions and those who don't have formal positions. It's not the prerogative of a few individuals with position titles and corresponding pay packets. People with and without position make things happen together. And this is it's important, but it's a really complex thing, and it raises many questions that perhaps we can discuss in coming months via our website and our blog, because it raises questions about how does that happen? How do people come together in leadership rather than acting as isolated individuals? How do we ensure that service users and employees and community members all contribute to and influence the direction of an organisation, influence people coming on board, How are people with position influenced by those without? And what kind of mechanisms and organisations do we put in place to make that happen? So if these values are important to us of inclusion and participation, the question is, how do we embed those into leadership so that leadership is not contradicting those principles, because leadership looks like something quite different in terms of being very authoritarian and residing just with one or two individuals. And going on to the next slide, the third reason I suggest that a collaborative approach to leadership is relevant for voluntary organisations is that most voluntary organisations work in a context in which crossing organisational and sector boundaries is a feature, it would seem, of everyday practice. So leadership of projects, programs and partnerships all cross boundaries. In my own working practice, that's often meant if I sit at a table as a senior manager or as chief exec of a voluntary organisation, I'm sitting with other people who are in similar positions in their own organisations. We're each representing different organisations. We don't have authority over one another. So it's much more about negotiating our way forwards. And in doing that, all of the organisations we're representing necessarily have their own interests, their own aims, their different resources. There are power dynamics at play. It's not an equal playing field. And of course, there is a lot of literature around this in terms of voluntary sector collaboration with the public sector and the way in which voluntary organisations and their representatives may often feel that they are the weaker partner. And that's a really big issue for working collaboratively, leading collaboratively from voluntary organisations. So what research tells us is that leading across boundaries always involves compromises, tensions and dilemmas. It's not at all an easy thing to do. There will be competing interests. The differences between organisations that bring us together to collaborate will also cause difficulties between us. These are things we have to work through in everyday practice, but it is important that we think in terms of that collaborative approach to leadership. Now, you've been listening to us for quite a while, so we're going to ask you to do something now. Hopefully on your screen you can see that we have a poll question. So from what you've heard so far, which of course is a very brief introduction to collaborative approaches to leadership, here's our question. The poll will be open for about 4 or 5 minutes, and hopefully you can tick one of these boxes and we'll come back and tell you what the results of the poll are later on. So, do you agree that a collaborative approach to leadership is particularly relevant for voluntary organisations? Do you strongly agree, disagree, or strongly disagree? Tell us what you think. And as you do that, I'm just coming to the end of my part of the presentation with some very brief thoughts for reflection, and then I will be passing back to my colleagues. So on the next slide, what does all of this mean for collaborative leadership practice in a voluntary organisation? Some very preliminary thoughts. Firstly, that there is a danger that we move away from the hero kind of model of leadership in which we think that individuals are the answer to all our leadership problems, and actually then think that a collaborative approach is the answer to all our problems. And we would just want to urge you from jumping from one approach to another, really, without being critical about that, because all of the research shows that a collaborative approach is incredibly difficult to take. And part of that, and I think Owen will come back to this in his comments, is questioning and challenging and receiving challenge, a challenge to ourselves about how to make that part of a collaborative approach. So a collaborative approach doesn't necessarily mean, or it doesn't mean at all, that we get rid of all our differences, that we hide our differences, but how do we surface them while still working collaboratively? Next thing I want to suggest we think about is that we think in terms of the long view. One of the issues that arises in my own research is, and my own practice is a recognition that collaborative projects and partnerships come and go incredibly quickly, and I'm sure many of you have experienced this. But actually, collaboration between organisations is quite long-term. So even though partnerships and projects disappear quite quickly. How do we hang on in for the long term, and what does it mean to do that when all the mechanisms of collaboration often appear and disappear so quickly? Next bullet point, the academic Joseph Rowland encourages us to think about leaderful practice in an organisation. What we mean by that is just thinking through this collaborative approach in terms of how do people at different levels and different places in the organisation contribute to leadership? What might make that happen? What mechanisms would enable it? And finally, identify the tensions from your own perspective. There will indeed be tensions and compromises to be made. You would expect me to say this, but of course you can learn an awful lot more about this on our Introduction to Collaborative Leadership, our free leadership course, which you can sign up to via the links from the Centre for Voluntary Sector Leadership. I'm just going to look across at my colleague who's hosting us to see how we got on in the poll. So, really interesting. So, over 43% of you strongly agree that collaborative leadership is relevant. 52% agree, 4.3% disagree, and nobody strongly disagrees. That's really great. What I'd really encourage you to do is to interact with us via the Centre for Voluntary Sector Leadership website to tell us why you think some of that, or indeed you can log on now and chat to us or pose some questions to us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carol, and thank you to all of you for participating in our poll. That's very encouraging for us, as collaborative leadership is one of the areas that we research. But as Carol said, please do feel free to interact with us. Tell us about what other aspects or challenges that you are facing that you would like us to look into. I'm just now going to introduce our next presenter, Owain. So Owen's research focuses on the dynamics of leadership development, the practice of leadership, and the conceptual underpinning of leadership. He has an extensive background in leadership development practice, designing and facilitating leadership development programs for senior managers across the sectors, even in New Zealand at the New Zealand Leadership Institute in Auckland. And prior to gaining his PhD, Owen worked in professional politics for the Labour Party in the UK. So over to you, Owen.
Thanks, Siv. So you mentioned I used to work for the Labour Party, which is going to divide opinions already. So I almost feel tempted now that you've all come out and said you're in favour of collaborative leadership to kind of, even though I really believe in it, to be the kind of devil's advocate and put the case for leaders. And so maybe we'll do some of that actually as we go through. So I wanted to start this by talking about the differences between leadership development and leader development. And actually, this is really leadership development. I'm going to argue is kind of code for saying how you develop collaborative leadership, I guess. Whereas leader development is more about how you develop yourselves as individual leaders. This is quite an obvious distinction to make, but it was made by an academic called David Day back in, I believe, 2001 in quite a seminal research paper where he proposed this division. But it is actually quite important because if we say, like you just did in actual fact, that we want more collaborative leadership, we need to be more collaborative in our practice, then why are the training programs and development initiatives we undertake still very much leader-focused rather than leadership-focused? So a leader development program will often feature things like people coming out of their employing organizations, being in a room with people from different organizations, and being exposed to lots of consultants who take you through psychometric profiles, tell you what kind of person you are. Often they're quite pricey, they can be at country retreats and this kind of thing, and they can make people feel quite important and more confident. So you can already see some of the pluses of this kind of approach, which it does tend to increase confidence. It can make you a bit more self-critical perhaps. The downsides are, of course, that it tends to remove you from the practice, from the context in which you actually do leadership. And if we want to develop more collaborative forms of leadership practice, and this kind of approach probably doesn't make that much sense. So what would be the point, for example, of taking, if Carol, Siv and I are working together to build this centre, what would be the point of lifting me up and sending me, I don't know, to a nice sort of country retreat in Woburn up the road to reflect and develop my own kind of personality as a leader? Well, it might make me feel more confident and a bit better about myself. But it wouldn't necessarily make a huge difference to how we practice leadership in the everyday. So the word practice here, as I've indicated on the slide, is really, really important. And again, practice sounds like an incredibly obvious word, but practice is something we sort of take for granted. We turn up to work, we go through our routines, and we have a certain way of conducting conversations, meetings, the rooms we sit within, and we often don't sort of stop and think that actually some of this stuff can be changed, and we develop these kind of habits of leadership. So I guess leadership development is about pulling apart what we do every day in a way that can actually get us to question some of the fundamentals about how we exist in organisations, really, and how we can put these things back together in a different way to create radically different feel to the direction in which we take our organisation, which we all call, why not, leadership. So in summary, a sort of leader development perspective would ask, how can I improve myself or my own marketability? Because let's face it, marketability in job markets is important in all this. And it shifts on to the terrain of what do I need to do and who do I need to be to make leadership work more effectively in this place and with these people. That's quite a tortuous definition, really, which encompasses practice and identity. So we're going to talk a bit about identity rather than personality. In leader development, you worry a lot about the kind of person you are, whereas in leadership development, you worry about the person you need to be in order, and the group you need to be in actual fact, which is what we're going to call identity. So let's move on to discuss some of the main features of leadership development. So I suppose it goes without saying, really, that in leadership development, you can't really sit back and kind of listen to a parade of very interesting experts or speakers. Leadership development tends to be far more hands-on. You can just see this in the layout of rooms very often in leadership development, where people sit in a kind of semicircle with a facilitator. In other words, they're always grappling with problems, real problems inside their own organisations, rather than sitting there and kind of listening to I don't know, to an academic, for example, talking about a new theory of leadership. Some of this stuff is important, but it's more of a balance between actually getting the problems in the room against and with leadership ideas, rather than a kind of more passive sitting, listening and asking questions at the end kind of a dynamic. So there are lots of talk goes on in leadership development programs and lots of creating as well. So it's increasingly common for leadership development programs to employ techniques from the world of the arts, where you might model something together, you might draw something together to make sense of a real problem you're trying to encounter. And leadership development is really important because it asks these very big questions about what your organisation needs to be and the kind of things it needs to be doing in its leadership. So this is often referred to as the kind of wicked question. And when I'm working with leadership groups, often what we do is we take fairly simple, what appear to be quite simple and basic organisational issues. They usually manifest as HR type issues, problems you have with employee or a line manager and so on. You gradually build up until the problem is much bigger and needs a bigger kind of leadership solution. You do assume, though, in leadership development that the problem and the solution lies in the room. So often on programs, it's funny, my colleagues in New Zealand and I used to say that it's the people in the room always say that it's the people outside the room who need the leadership development. If for example, you're in a health context and you're working with a group of nurses, they'll always say that it's the consultants who need more leadership. But if you're working with the consultants, they'll always say it's the nurses who need more leadership, and so on. So you assume the problem is in the room, which means that these programs can be fairly confrontational in a way, and shouldn't be afraid of kind of getting people to face up to their responsibilities to make things happen and to change things. And that is one of the dynamics of a collaborative approach to leadership. So leadership development programs tend to be far more critical, I would say, than leader programs. What I mean by critical is they start to question the conceptual value and underpinnings of leadership, and they should actually, they damn well should, because leadership, actually scholarship, is quite a shaky thing. I don't think it's one of the more conceptually unsound ideas out there in organisation studies, and it should be pulled apart and questioned a lot. Often leadership is used as a kind of, am I allowed to use the word sexy? I just have. It's a kind of, as a kind of sexy badge that just encompasses all kinds of other things. You know, like you can turn up to a leadership development program and suddenly find yourself studying marketing or strategy, and it becomes so imprecise, but it's a kind of sexy, alluring way of pulling people into probably training they would have had anyway, regardless of this label leadership. So we should be precise and critical about what we mean by leadership. So is leadership about a kind of collective, collaborative direction towards big, important issues and surfacing what we mean by these issues? So that's very different to management, and it's very different to command, both of which are very important things nevertheless. Command, very important, for example, in uniformed services and in professional organisations, and of course we'd all be completely lost without management, obviously. So let's just talk a bit about some of the practices perhaps in leadership development, because we've talked a bit about the ideas underpinning leadership development. So these are the kinds of things I tend to work on in leadership development programs, but of course there might be, and there definitely are, out there other kind of ways of approaching this and different practices we could introduce. But Carol and I, in the courses we wrote together, will share the link with you afterwards. They're free courses. We do go through some of these practices. So exploring the unknown is, I think, really, really important in leadership development, because it's about how you come together and ask each other kind of big questions that will disrupt the everyday, but maybe will get you focused on some of the more important things you should be thinking about. You know, I've been in a room with hospital consultants who, as a result of being there, have gone away and started a collaboration on how to tackle diabetes in their communities, because they realised the systemic problem was actually getting too many people through the door with diabetes, so they wanted to kind of tackle the health issue rather than treat it as a sickness issue. That's just one example. But that needed a collaborative approach. They couldn't do that kind of thing on their own. They couldn't just do that as leaders. They needed leadership. So, and we've mentioned that talk is really important, and it's amazing how bad we are at conversations, actually, you know, but, and I'm as bad as anyone, but we can sit in meetings and think about the next important thing we want to say, or the next thing we want to say that will sound fairly smart. And that's understandable, because, you know, we all rely on looking good in our organisations to make money and keep our families fed and all of that, but that's not necessarily what's going to make leadership tick in the best way. You know, being present and actively listening and building on a conversation, asking questions that open it up, telling someone you appreciate what they're saying, or actually just disagreeing with someone and creating a bit of a conflict where one needs to happen are really important. And it never ceases to amaze sort of how committed organisations tend to be to facts, logic and numbers, rather than sort of moving people in a more kind of storied and interesting way. So I often spend time actually helping people in leadership develop interesting stories and different types of stories you can tell to move people. That could be colleagues, clients, or whatever, really. Obviously, being self-critical and self-reflexive is really important. It's quite a well-known, I think, facet of humanity, that we tend to rate ourselves a bit more highly than other people rate us. Well, that's not always the case, obviously. And probably the people in this room are the opposite, but never mind. In general, that tends to be true. So it's always quite helpful to be self-critical and self-reflexive. You know, how am I contributing to this problem? How can I contribute to the solution? So framing and reframing is another language issue, really, and it's to do with making a problem bigger and more wicked and more complicated. But it's amazing how we get into habits of kind of looking at problems in very functional ways. Oh, this is a marketing problem. This is an accounting problem. This is a management problem. Whereas framing something as a leadership problem is a bit more scary. And often challenges the kind of common ways of seeing and thinking that organisations hold. I've mentioned conflict already, but I would just say that I guess as I worked in New Zealand for a bit, and I would say that New Zealanders are fairly similar to us in this regard, probably a bit more confrontational, but we will do almost anything to avoid conflict. It's in our DNA that we tend to hate it and we tend to run away from it. That doesn't mean that we won't complain about things over tea and biscuits, and I do that as much as anyone. But oftentimes it's just better for collaborative leadership to get the conflict out there, because conflict actually is a sign that people care about stuff. They care about their organisation, they care about issues, so why can't we have more of it? Now, I'm not talking here about the kind of nasty bullying personal conflict, but about principal conflict about what an organisation should be doing in terms of its leadership. And experimenting with identity, which is the last one here, might sound like a kind of funny thing to put on a slide about leadership, and I don't mean I could sound a bit un-PC here, so I don't mean, well, maybe I do mean actually experimenting with your identity in all kinds of different ways. You know, why not? And but I more mean, like, you know, if you're regarded, for example, as the kind of, I don't know, the kind of super creative artistic genius type inside your organisation, why not experiment with a different kind of identity if that's what your leadership needs? Maybe you need to be the kind of dependable person who always finishes their reports on time and so on, and vice versa. So often in development programs, we actually, you know, if someone is struggling to get their heads around what is required of them, I often just ask them outright, try and be someone different today. Who are you going to try and be today? Try to be that person for the day. See what it does to the leadership process and to the way you're thinking about things. You know, and sometimes maybe I'll just want to come into work and be a bit different sometimes. That's quite a refreshing thing to do, I think. I'm being signalled at, but maybe it's a good time to do the poll, but I just want to finish a few more points first. So I think experimenting with exploring uncertainty is quite important, because I think a lot of stuff we just don't know in organisations, and management is often about trying to make sense or to make things fit what we already know, whereas leadership is about being more comfortable, having a dialogue about what we don't know and maybe what we need to do in order to know a bit better. But also leadership development, you know, can be a kind of way of disciplining people inside organisations, and it can be a way of monitoring and keeping an eye on people. And so trust is obviously very important for leadership development. So it's important that you know what is said in rooms sort of stays in rooms and is accepted in that kind of spirit, really. So leadership development isn't actually for everyone. It's important to say that. Some organisations might just need a much better command system or management system, for example. So let's do the poll now then. And I think the poll asks you something along the lines of: leadership development is needed inside my organisation or broader working group. By broader working group, I mean a kind of a system of leadership, I guess, that might stretch across organisational boundaries. So let's do that poll, and whilst you're doing that, we'll move on to a paper that we just had accepted in management learning. It's based on some data from participants we worked with in New Zealand, and I thought this was relevant because we actually had a look at the reflective language people used as they went through a leadership development program. And I can't remember the precise number of participants we looked at now, but it was over 100 anyway. It was quite a lot of people. And what we found is that their experiences of leadership development were intrinsically aesthetic. What do I mean by aesthetic? What I mean is that their experiences couldn't really be quantified. It was more of a feel. They developed a sense of beauty, I suppose, in working together with other people. Something that could only be made sense of through their senses, through their sense of touch, their smell, their relationality to other people, the way they felt out situations. And we kind of broke these down into a number of different themes for how people experienced it. I guess you could just call them discourses, really. And these were partiality, dissipation, disruption, sensation, and connectedness. So partiality is the sense that you never fully, when you're in a leadership mindset, you never fully know, you never fully master what you're doing. You're always collaborating with other people to make sense of what's going on because you're dealing with complexity. Dissipation is the sense in leadership that you almost get a glimpse and you think you've got the answer to a problem or to what leadership is, but it quickly goes away again. And then it's almost like a wave coming in and out of a beach. disruption is obviously that if you adopt a leadership mindset, that it's going to just shake your world a lot, isn't it? Because you're thinking in a far bigger way, in a far different way about things in general. Sensation gets across this idea that you in a leadership mindset, you feel things much more. You get more excited, you get more angry, you feel things through your emotions, through your sense of touch, and so on. And connectedness means that I guess as the whole point of what Carol was saying is that leadership makes no sense without other people. So you are always in a state of relationality and connectedness with people as you're moving through. And I don't know if these themes are generalizable. Actually, maybe that's something for you to answer. We took a broad range of people from voluntary organisations, public, private, and this is what we came out with. But that was in New Zealand. It might be different in other places and at different times and so on. But I think it gives you quite an important clue as to how leadership development feels, and that this kind of range of feelings as you go through as a participant might not be for every organisation. So should we see what's happened in the poll? Results are coming through. You can see Lucy writing them down furiously. Yeah, so it's a bit more, so I guess it's a bit more lukewarm than the other ones. So 27% of you strongly agree that we need more leadership development. Just under 64% agree, but there are nearly 10% of you that disagree. And maybe that's to be expected, really, because I don't know what you two think, but you know, sometimes you just want to go about your day as a kind of individual, I guess, don't you? At work, you want get on with what you feel comfortable with and good at. And if somebody suddenly pulls you into a room as a collective and says, right, we need to get you drawing together, having heated conversations about what matters, it's actually quite a hard thing to do.
Probably to respond to that, you've answered that question already, really, Owen, by saying, no, this is not for everybody at all times. So there's something about context, isn't there, and the place that your organisation is at, and structure and purpose that may or may not make this.
Yeah, and I'm as bad as everyone. I mean, I do develop a lot, but I found myself in things in the last year where I've turned as a participant, and I actually do find it quite uncomfortable. So I guess the final point I can make is that facilitating these things is facilitation sounds easy because it's kind of like actually delivering as much content as you would if you're teaching, but it's actually far harder. Making sure they're staying on top of content and making people feel safe and valued. I've got anything else to say? I don't think I've got anything else to say at this point.
Sure. I just picked up a question from the chat that's coming in. Sorry, I'm just moving closer to the speaker. It's Carol back here again. So the question was, you mentioned influence in a voluntary organisation. How can a voluntary organisation ensure the culture of collaborative leadership is prevalent? And it's a really good question. Thank you for that question. Not an easy one for us to answer. But I suppose maybe I'll say something, then I might come back and want to add something different. But I just felt, listening to Owen, that he was beginning to take us on that journey, really, about how you might begin to change organisational culture or develop it towards collaborative leadership. And I was thinking particularly of what you said, Owen, about storytelling and how important that might be in terms of the stories, the narratives that predominate around an organisation and the stories that we tell to one another. And storytelling, I mean, it can come from the top of an organisation, it can be written in official strategies, but actually storytelling is something that we all do all of the time, whether we're very conscious of it or not. I don't know, does that fit with what you were saying, or I know, did you have a different?
Oh, I think there's all kinds of things we're unconscious about at work, don't you think? Absolutely,
yeah.
And these and unconscious habits are actually very hard to surface because they're unconscious and very technology driven. Actually, that's something I didn't mention at all. The way technology has changed organisations, actually, it's quite unhelpful, I think, to think even about individuals like human beings. Actually, what we can do through the technologies and spaces in which we inhabit. habit, right? So
that's a bit of a scary story.
It is, yeah, sure. But this, that can be liberating. Like this kind of session, we couldn't possibly have done that this years ago and be communicating with you in this way. But that said, we're controlled in different habitual ways as well, and we're just picking up maybe the sound is coming in and out. So is that because we're not talking that loudly enough?
Oh, the sound is drifting in and out. People keep saying there are also a few more questions coming in.
I like the
via
Marxist
and
question.
thank you very much for those. I will leave it to Carol and Owen to think whether they want to pick up on some of those.
I was intrigued by Gethin's Marxist point. I suppose I am a bit of an unreformed Marxist, so maybe I'm the cuckoo in the nest in all of this. So yeah, I totally get the suspicion with leadership, because it's the critique, right, is that it gets people in charge. It kind of naturalizes the status of people in charge, and it tells people that in some kind of way that some people are kind of born to lead and others aren't. So it kind of naturalizes hierarchy. So I guess what we're talking about is the opposite of that. It's a kind of I've heard it described as anti-leadership in some kind of ways. That said, it does help to have someone who's accountable and in charge very often, doesn't it? So this thing is a kind of balance, I guess, between constructive challenge and collaboration and still being accountable for decisions that people make and whatnot.
Thank you, Owain. So there are a number of questions coming in, which is really great, and thank you for that. So it's Steve here. You can probably hear the difference between Carol and myself, but never mind. So there's one question that I would like to pick up on, which is whether you need to be a good traditional leader in order to be a good leadership developer or collaborative leader. And I think this kind of tension between collaborative leadership and an individual leader is an interesting one, and one that we could probably talk about at length. My own research would suggest that leadership or collaborative leadership is something about being mindful of what it is that you're trying to lead in a collaborative manner. But it's not necessarily an easy task, and it doesn't necessarily have those kind of ideologies of support and nurturing around it all the time. So I think what we find from our research is that if you want to lead in a collaborative manner, you have to do the usual sort of empowering, embracing, involving and mobilizing, and recognizing that individuals are coming to a situation with different sets of experiences, with different perspectives, and indeed working within organizational structures that have specific or that places specific requirements on a leader. So I noticed previously that one of you commented on the kind of regulations on the context in which you're working. So there is certainly something about leading in the spirit of collaboration, embracing, empowering, involving, and mobilizing. But we find also that if you want to make something happen, if you want to lead the collaboration forward, then you also may have to be prepared to engage in politicking with small p, and maybe kind of mobilizing a little bit in the background, so that there is a tension, I think, between what a leader needs to do in order to lead its collaboration and the sort of more embracing aspects of leadership. So I don't know if you have a view on that tension.
I do. So I think I don't know what Siv has found in her research, but the habit of going back slightly to what Gethin is saying as well, I guess. So that the habit of having the leader in charge and the follower being passive is actually something that is ingrained into the way we think, not just in organisations but in societies as well. So the quick and simple example of this is how much of the sports pages are dominated by, whether a certain manager is will get better. So the argument that Keith Grint makes is that he's a leadership scholar, is that this suits everyone. Actually, it suits leaders because they feel more important, they have more power, and so on. And it suits followers because they can kind of sit back and be a bit passive and blame the leader when everything goes wrong. So I don't know what Siv thinks about how challenging it is to actually change that kind of mindset and move to a more collaborative, or maybe how fair it is either, because you're asking everyone to take more responsibility for leadership, and that can mask all kinds of problems. So one problem might be you're dressing up pretty unpleasant tasks as and badging them as leadership, right? But you're distributing that. Maybe some people just want to turn up at work, do a kind of fair day work, and just leave because they've functional reasons, and that's absolutely fine. And I'm starting to ramble a bit here, but what I'm coming back to, is that it's actually really hard to get people into a mindset of collaborative leadership. Sometimes there are great reasons for that. Sometimes it's more, and we do need followers. Of course, we need followers. There's a tendency to romanticize and glamorize leadership, that everyone needs to be a leader, but that's clearly not the case. We need really good, robust followers who can challenge leaders. More questions?
Sorry, we're just kind of struggling a little bit with our technology here. I can't even get them out.
We're going to scroll down and see what else is going on. So Erica's been looking at followership, and in the context of voluntary organisations with a commitment to young women's leadership and how that might mean. Yes, actually, so gender is something we did not mention, and it's so important in leadership in general. It may take us slightly off topic, but so the big critique of leader-based sort of theories to leadership is they're very masculine. So if you look at trait perspectives and you actually pull these apart, what you end up coming up with is a kind of description of a certain type of kind of alpha male, if you like. So that's one of the critiques that feminists have levelled very fairly at leadership studies. But the interesting twist in all this is now that collaborative leadership becomes sort of more trendy, if you like, that men start to dominate that as well. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what used to be the kind of strong domain for women then gets colonised. It's not a straightforward answer actually, but collaborative just overcomes a lot of these gender issues. You can find that that women get marginalised in collaborative leadership as well.
So this is Carol. I'm just going to come back on that as a woman who might be slightly older, without confessing to any particular age. And I think it's really interesting, that comment from Erica, because perhaps one of the things, and I say this as a woman, is that many women have kind of fought a little bit of a battle to be in conventional leadership positions, and then we're asking them to step back and listen and to work in a different kind of way. And I would agree that that's incredibly challenging. Something that I take that comment on myself, and I think it's something that would be really interesting to think further about. We've got other questions. We're just reading our other questions.
Reading Jim's point, so I'd agree you need traditional leadership skills, but there's a different balance of these in an organisation of volunteers, because of the volunteers' different expectations. Yes, exactly. So I think one of the beauties of kind of looking at collaborative leadership practice is that yes, you disrupt roles. It doesn't mean that everybody has to be equal, right? So not everybody has to take on a similar amount of responsibility, but it does mean that I actually don't like the word empowered, but I'm going to use it now anyway. But people feel empowered. Yeah, I can't think of a substitute. So people feel empowered to be able to step up and challenge the kind of identity and role that they've been allotted, and step into different identities as and when, really, I suppose. It doesn't mean a completely flat hierarchy.
And I think quite rightly, Jeff, you challenge us there. We haven't focused today, and perhaps it's another webinar or blog piece around how volunteers in particular contribute to leadership, and what the issues are there around the power dynamics of staff and volunteers, and the different reasons that people are motivated to volunteer. So yeah, lots of complexities there.
And so just to probably be the last thing I'd say, but just to build on what Carol says, that most leadership and leadership development research assumes or uses data from a context where you're dealing with people who are being paid to be there, that they're in those kind of relationships at work, and actually it doesn't look very much at organisations where leadership might be done by volunteers or where volunteers are being led.
Thank you, Carol, and thank you, Owain, and thank you to all of you for participating and joining in with us today. It's been really enjoyable for us, and I hope we can carry on interacting in this way and via other means as well. Before we leave, though, we have one more poll for you, which hopefully should appear on your screen. And so that's basically asking you, if we run similar lunchtime webinars in the future, how likely would you be to attend? And so we would obviously like to hear from you about that. And whilst you do that, we're going to put a link up to our leadership development courses, which Owain and Carol wrote, and Owen is just going to say a little bit about them.
Yeah, so first things first, these are absolutely 100% free. There's no hidden costs or anything here, and these are two leadership development courses that Carol and I put together specifically for voluntary sector organisations. The first one lasts 5 weeks and introduces you to the concept and idea of leadership, differentiates leadership from other concepts, and but also gets into some practice stuff as well. And then the second one, which is the badged open course, which means you get a little certificate at the end. Actually, I think you get a certificate for the first one as well. Anyway, you get a more important certificate for the first one. And it lasts 8 weeks, but that more tightly focuses on collaborative leadership. As I say, they are completely free. I mean, you might feel at the end of it that you'd like to enroll in an OU course, but you know, that do these as self-contained courses, and they are quite interactive in the sense that we've got some we've got a reflective diary space on there for you to use to take stock on what you're thinking about leadership, and a forum where you can communicate with. Occasionally we pop on and have a conversation.
Thank you, Owain. And we're just looking across the table to see if we have the result of our poll, and once we've given you that, we will close for today. And here we go. And so thank you, everybody. So it looks like this was interesting for you too. So 56% say that you're likely, or strongly agree that you're likely to participate again, and 40% say that you agree that you will, and just a small percentage feel maybe that they may not want to, and that's absolutely fine. Thank you all very much for joining in today. And so I know that our colleague James Rees will write to you all on Monday, and we will otherwise keep you informed of future webinars that we will be running shortly. So I think that's all from us. So thank you very much, and thanks everyone. Thanks everyone.